Hello, this is a podcast for learners of English, and this episode is all about the IELTS test, and it's sponsored by italki, a service that you could definitely use to get loads of practice in preparation to do IELTS. You can find a teacher on italki who does IELTS preparation stuff, practice parts of the speaking exam, practice coming up with ideas, get the feedback you need on your writing, and also work on all your core skills with a one-to-one teacher from the comfort of your own home with italki. It's a great idea. They've got something like 2 million people using it. It's amazing. Anyway, when you buy some talking time with italki, they'll send you a voucher worth a free lesson. To get the offer, go to teacherluke.co.uk.
You're listening to Luke's English Podcast.
Or click
For
an
more
italki
information,
logo
visit
on my website.
teacherluke.co.uk.
Hello listeners, I hope you're well. Here is part 2 of this double episode that I'm doing about IELTS, this well-known exam that tests your level of English. Learners all over the world are taking IELTS, preparing for it, suffering from it, recovering from it, so I'm sure that most of you are aware of it. Here's an episode about it. As usual, in these multi-part episodes, I suggest that you listen to the first part before listening to this. In this episode, I'm talking to Ben Worthington from IELTSpodcast.com. He specialises in helping people get ready for IELTS. And in this episode, we're going through some questions from listeners on social media about this test. Listen up if you have experience of IELTS, but equally, if you don't have to take the test, I hope you can enjoy this episode in full relaxation mode, since you won't actually have to take this evil test. In this episode, you'll hear Ben and me saying various things about IELTS. Here's a rundown of the conversation and the things we mention. So we talk about how to prepare for IELTS, self-study and using a course, tips for writing, reading, listening and speaking, the importance of getting feedback on essay writing, using websites like scribd.com for past papers, self-study tips for the speaking test, the potential risks of taking group IELTS courses, tips for how to get the best out of an online tutor, the importance of making a good first impression in part 1 of the speaking test, how to get ideas in speaking part 2, using cue cards to practice the speaking test, thinking on your feet and speaking spontaneously, and focusing on core skills. So we're talking about a lot of specific English skills and exam skills, considering the whole approach and mindset that you need to succeed in IELTS. That's what this is all about. As a special gift to my listeners as well, Ben is offering a 15% discount on his IELTS preparation course, which is called Jump to Band 7 or it's free. So on his website, check out the course and you can use the offer code Luke15 to get a 15% discount, which is not bad. Anyway, you know what to expect from this episode now, so let's carry on. So you're talking about the importance of getting feedback from someone. So that kind of brings us into the next set of questions I've got here, which is basically like, how do people prepare for IELTS? And I've got a question from Ash Raffle on Facebook that said, how do you prepare well for IELTS? Eduardo on Facebook said, hi, I'm doing the test soon. Could you give me a study plan for me to follow? And Nguyen Dui Huang Min, whose name I probably just got completely wrong, wrote, what are the best ways to self-study IELTS writing and speaking? So what's the best IELTS preparation strategy for self-study students and non-self-study students then?
Right. Well, I think I would definitely, for self-study students, and this is where I could speak to this better because this is like my field. I help a lot of students online, the website. But even before coming and getting help, I'd strongly recommend that you take a practice test and you find out which areas you're weak in, and then you focus on those. So maybe you might find that your reading is a complete disaster. So now you know to focus on your reading. And the reading and listening, personally, I think you can prepare without a tutor. Maybe getting some tips online is going to be helpful. But I think with these tests, with these two parts of the exam, it's a case of getting familiar and then really just drilling down. So you do a practice test, and then maybe you realize that multiple choice is the part where you lose the most points. So the next time you do an IELTS practice test in the listening, for example, maybe you just do the multiple choice part, and maybe you do 5 or 6 multiple choice parts from different tests until you can get a grip on this part. And then you go back to taking the whole reading test or the whole listening test again. And it's just a case of like breaking it down and applying like a systematic approach to it. And this is probably the fastest and most effective way regarding the speaker, regarding the listening and the reading. Now, when it comes to writing, we want to do something broadly similar. For the writing, I'd recommend you look at some model sample essays. We've got those. If you just go online and put IELTS Podcast model sample essays, you'll see them there. Yeah. Also, you want to have a look at what some good essays look like. Also, in some future podcasts and some past podcasts, there's myself and another tutor, and we're reviewing and commenting on what made this essay good and what made it bad and where the student would have picked up points.
Yeah.
So you really want to get familiar with it. And then once you're familiar with it and you know you've got a brief idea and you've probably written a few essays out yourself or even copied a few essays out, pen and paper, that's always good as well.
Yeah.
Then it's the time to start getting feedback. And we offer an essay correction service, and the tutor will go over it. She's supremely qualified. She's an absolute star, actually. Yeah. And she'll give you some really good feedback. And sometimes the students say, "Hey, Ellen, this is a bit harsh. You destroyed my essay." And I say, "Hey, Ellen, calm down." But she always wants to sort of like make sure the student's getting like the full Monty, the full explanation of what needs to be done.
Yes.
And then just one last thing regarding the writing. Once the student gets this feedback, they want to really take a similar approach to what they've done with the listening or the reading, and which is like, okay, I can see that I've got a problem with the articles. Now what I need to do is go and get a good English grammar book, like the English Grammar in Use by Murphy, I think it is, Raymond Murphy.
Yep.
And really just drill through that on the articles, learn the rules, do some online quizzes. And once you've got it up to a certain level, then write another essay. And this is really important. After writing that second essay, go back and self-check it yourself, because this is a skill in itself that you need for the exam, because you can easily boost your score come exam day if you're self-checking or effectively self-checking your own work.
Okay, right. So just going back to something you said there, you said the first thing you should do is to take a practice test. Where can people actually find practice tests that they can do?
Scribd.com has quite a few there. I think they're a bit grey, like they're not super legal and they're not illegal. It's a bit grey. Students uploaded past exam papers or whatever.
Scribd, that's SCRIBD.com.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
So there are some potentially, what's the word for it? Fraudulent or pirated, that's it. Maybe some people have uploaded old exam papers there slightly illegally, the way they do online. But anyway, there may or may not be. Obviously we would not condone that kind of thing. But
absolutely, it's horrendous.
But nevertheless, you may find some exam papers on Scribd.com, or just by Googling probably IELTS practice tests.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
that's a good way of doing it. And there was a site. I'll have to send it over to you later because it's escaped me at the moment. But there is a site where you can do IELTS listening tests. So just you can find those tests online.
Okay then. you've got different services on IELTSpodcast.com, which people can check out. I mean, this being probably only 1 or 2 episodes of Luke's English podcast, we can't necessarily go into all of the specific things right now, and a study plan and all that stuff. But I think you've got lots of stuff on your website that people could check out.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And there's just one last thing I'd like to say for the self-study students regarding the speaking. This is a bit more challenging, and at the moment, we used to offer feedback where students could send in their MP3s and we'd give some feedback like that, but it wasn't too popular. So I think the best way to do this is, one, to get familiar with the exam and try and you can look online at model exams of what's happened between an examiner and student and get familiar with it. And also perhaps even online classes. And with this, if you are going to do the online classes, I think one-on-one classes are the best. And this brings me on to the point of, for students who aren't doing self-study classes, so who aren't doing self-study preparation and maybe going to an academy. In that case, I would really be aware, because a couple of months ago, I was interviewing a guy called Yanis, I think his name was, who just successfully passed the exam. Yeah. And he spent a couple of grand. He was living in New Zealand. He saw an offer in Canberra in Australia for like a month in IELTS course. And he said it was absolutely crackers, because he was just sat there in the class. There's like 3 Saudi Arabians, a couple of Chinese, 2 Germans, and he was saying he was the best in the class. I think he was from the Czech Republic, but he was saying like, if this teacher wasn't speaking, then he had to be listening to them, and they were all taking it in turns and speaking with their accent. Fair enough, understandable. Of course, it's not going to be perfect, but also it's not going to be that beneficial for Yanis, who sat there and is listening to some, all these different accents with this tutor, and he gets maybe 5-10 minutes speaking time, and the rest is either the tutor or the other students. And and in the end, he said that it's much better just preparing for it by himself, and obviously a lot more economical doing it that way too.
So so it's always a risk when you go into a group class. You just don't know what the dynamic's going to be in there and all those things.
Exactly.
But so maybe self-study using some of the techniques that you talk about, and probably getting a one-to-one teacher would be a good idea at some point. That's where you can get the feedback from the speaking and the writing, and you can do, other things like that as well.
Yeah. But can I just say one thing? If you are going for an online tutor, be careful that they don't waste your time with shoddy tactics like, oh, what do you do in your free time? Oh, how was your weekend? And stuff. You want focused, dedicated practice on certain areas. So maybe you could just say, look, here's a list of questions. Ask me all these questions and write down the errors that I make, and then send me the list afterwards. I think there's a time and a place for general chit chat and stuff like that. But if you've got your exam coming up and you want to get the most out of your class, then taking control and doing something like what I just said would be the best way to get a more effective lesson.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I just mentioned the risk of going into a class where you suddenly have to just, follow what's going on. And even if you're not doing the talking and you've got to deal with other students and things like that, in a one-to-one lesson too, exactly as you said, you sometimes will have to step in and... Because the danger is when people get a teacher, they just give all the responsibility and all the control over to that teacher, and they essentially want, right, teacher, I want you to spoon feed me with your method. But sometimes it's a kind of a collaboration that learners of English must know, that when they get a one-to-one teacher, it's a sort of a collaboration. You've got to work at the beginning to tell that teacher what you expect. Some teachers don't like that. It's unfortunately you might find that some teachers react badly to that, and they're like, I'm the teacher, I decide, or they don't like students to tell them what to do. But I mean, I think any reasonable teacher should be willing to incorporate what that learner wants. So you've got to try, if you get a one-to-one teacher, you've got to try different people until you find someone who's receptive to basically getting down to business regarding regarding the IELTS preparation work you want to do, rather than just spending half an hour of like, so what about your weekend? And also often teachers will be quite happy to talk about themselves. Teacher talking time. You've got to try to, I don't know, sometimes you need to let people know when that's enough. You know, I know I'm practicing my listening skills, but let's get into the exams preparation work. I mean, I would even suggest sort of bringing some tasks to the class, and telling the teacher what you want them to do. Like, I want you to correct me. I want to do speaking practice with feedback. Let's look at the assessment criteria. When you mark my writing, can you use the criteria for it? The teacher might be like, "Oof, this is a tough student," but it's kind of, that's what it's involved in, getting what you want. I think.
I think you're totally right there. And it's a case of like finding a balance. If the teachers come in prepared, enthusiastic, and they've got a list of activities that corresponds to what you need and where you want to go, then super. You hit jackpot. And you probably maybe don't have to do that much, at least at the beginning. But sometimes the teacher will just turn up and expect that being a native English speaker is sufficient to do the whole hour without preparation. And in that case, then you've got to take real control and step up and take that responsibility, and also sort of like help the tutor along. Guide them along. But as you said, I think some tutors will come prepared, some tutors won't come prepared. And I would suggest sort of like seeing how the first class goes. But the moment you see it kind of just degenerating into general chit chat and happy go, just funny stories and blah, 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 and all this stuff, then is the time to step in and say, hey, I've brought these cue cards. Can we go over these, please? And I think, personally, if the teacher's good, they'd be happy that you're doing this, that you're initiative and helping them give you more value. And I think it's just, a win-win situation.
Absolutely. Okay. Let's move on to some more questions from my listeners regarding the writing and speaking tests. So Yabe on Twitter, I think that's Japanese. I think it means let's go, which is quite nice. About the speaking test, it says this: I've heard that in the speaking test, examiners usually judge candidates' rough scores before moving on to the second section. Is that true? If so, is it better to focus on the first section more than the others? I guess what this means is that this person has got the idea that examiners use the first section to judge the person's English, and that's what defines their speaking score more so than the other sections. Is the first section more important than the others?
I would say that it isn't. However, these are humans, and first impressions will probably impact or have at least some impact. But even so, the examiner has got to do all three sections. So the examiner might form an opinion at the beginning, but still they've got to go through part 2 and part 3. So there's still time to sort of like recover and impress the examiner and really shine. Even if you do make a complete mess of part 1, you've still got another 2 sections to go to recover. And then also with part 3, this is probably maybe where the examiner's judgment is going to come into the equation, and it's going to probably be more heavy, is because the examiner is really going to start testing you at this level, at this stage of the exam, just to see sort of like how hard or how difficult maybe the questions can get. Like, then this is what I was saying before, that you might hear this, what sounds like the same question asked again and again. And this is the examiner kind of probing your ability and really sort of like settling on a grade for you.
Because you mentioned before about when, let's say the question is, what do you think about globalization? And the student answers, and then the examiner says, but what might be some of the arguments against globalization? And what that examiner wants is for you to be able to acknowledge and to explain opinions that are not your own. Which is, it's like part 3 is often it's about abstract things, like being able to talk about things that are outside of you. So not just your personal opinions on things, but being able to talk about other people's opinions and what other people have said and the sort of the general consensus about a topic beyond just what you think of it,
Absolutely. And you'll probably know it from if you do speak French, yeah?
Yeah, I speak a bit of French. Yeah, I'm sort of B1 at the moment.
Oh, good. That's good.
It's not bad.
That's good.
It's enough.
But you probably know that, like, those levels, expressing those abstract ideas of maybe what other people, that's when you've got to pull out the big guns with your language capability, so to speak.
Yeah, that's where, I had a French test recently as part of my application for French citizenship ahead of Brexit. So I'm trying to protect my status, and I had to take a language test. The minimum requirement for the citizenship is B1, which I managed to get. But in the speaking exam, it was it was similar to an IELTS one, where the first part is basically kind of questions about you and little introductory questions. Second part is a long term, and the third part is discussing the topic of the long term. And the first part I was good, because I applied my the strategy that we know as teachers, which is you've got to make the good first impression, you've got to come across as a positive, communicative individual. And so I used I've got probably about 5 to 10 minutes of French conversation in me, before it starts to break down. So I did my absolute best in the first part, where it was like quite chatty and stuff. And then it as the test progressed, my French deteriorated as it went on. So I think in the IELTS speaking test, the first part is obviously very important, as you said, for making the right impression. But it's in parts 2 and 3 that you would really win the big points. That's where you get into the higher level scores. On part 1 alone, you can't get a 7 or an 8 probably. It's performing well in the other 2 parts. That's where you're going to get the high scores, I would say.
That's so true. And Luke, may I ask you, did you turn on the charm in part 1 of your French exam?
Oh yes, as much as possible. Yeah, as much as I possibly could. That's
awesome. Love it.
But it was in parts, in part 3 or something. I was sweating. So it was the middle of summer when I took the exam, and I walked to the exam centre. And by the time I got there, I was already pouring sweat. And then in the exam, I was okay at the beginning, but then when the pressure sort of, when the pressure came in, then I started to sweat, and I was literally like wiping the sweat off my forehead. My shirt was stuck to me. It was a disaster. And at the end of the test, I said to the girl, when she switched off the tape recorder, and I said to the girl, "Oh, part 3 was really, really difficult." And I said, "Part 3 was really, really difficult." And she said to me, "Oh, that's okay. We've got a lift." So she completely misunderstood what I'd said. And I was like, thank God that wasn't in the exam. Thank God she switched off the tape recorder. Clearly, I don't know what she thought I said. I think she thought I said, "Oh my God, I'm really hot. It's going to be difficult to walk down the stairs," or something. And what I wanted to say was part 3 was tough. She's like, "It's okay. We've got a lift." It's like, okay, great. Great. My French is... still needs a lot of work. Okay. Lynn Thoy Nguyen on Facebook asked me this question: how do we get ideas for speaking easily and quickly, especially in part 2? What happens in part 2? Can you just explain?
Right. Yeah. You get a choice of 3 cue cards. You can't see them, but you just select one. They're face down, and you pull out one, and then it might be something like describe your best, or describe your childhood friend, describe a memory you have with them, describe why you like them, and describe I don't know, an incident that happened between you, or a shared memory, or something like that. Okay, and then you've got about, I think it's 2 minutes to prepare. Oh no, maybe, I think it's about 2 minutes. Yeah. And then you talk, and you've got to explain who this friend is, and just basically working through the bullet points, because you want to get all the points in the bullet points, and it is very important to follow these. It's similar to task response. You know, if you've got a cue card about your best childhood friend, and then you talk about the importance of friendship, then it's going to be really difficult for the examiner to give you points. So the question, how do we get ideas quickly and easily for this? One strategy is, because they refresh the cue cards every quarter, okay? And this is only like a shortcut. I'm not a massive fan of shortcuts, as you probably heard. I think the best way is to get your core language up to an ability where you can talk confidently and competently about a range of different topics. However, I understand the situation from a student's point of view as well. So, as I was saying, new cue cards come out every quarter, and what I suggest students doing is getting a hold of these cue cards. We publish them on our site as well, and each quarter we put the new ones in there. And sometimes I'll do a new podcast as well, showing the students, like giving them sample answers, you know, and say, okay, this is the vocabulary I'd use. This is how I would explain this situation. But I suggest the student gets a hold of these lists and starts writing out their answers, of how they would speak, what they would say, just so that come exam day, there's no nasty surprises, you know?
Yeah.
And you could practice these cue cards in front of a mirror, or with a friend, or with your online tutor, just so that you can maybe find your limitations on certain topics while you're practicing, rather than discovering your limitations come exam day.
Yeah, so it's about finding part 2 exam tasks, more sample tasks like the cue cards you mentioned.
Yeah,
and just practicing, probably in the same conditions as in the exam, giving yourself a bit of time to prepare. And then, is it 2 minutes? They speak for 2 minutes, is it?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, they speak for 2 minutes. They've got about a minute to prepare.
So find loads of past part 2 tasks, and look at each one for a minute, prepare yourself, and then speak for 2 minutes. You could record it maybe and you listen back to it again, and do it over and over again with as many part 2 tasks as you can possibly find, attempting to make sure you deal with all the bullet points. And just practice, and after doing lots and lots of practice like that, of just trying to fulfill the criteria of each cue card, it'll start to become a sort of an automatic response. That
absolutely,
you'll just sort of slip back into the habitual thinking pattern of, this is, I'm doing speaking part 2, so just bang, bang, bang. It just sort of starts to become second nature, and you'll just come up with ideas. I mean, the ideas are actually often given to you, really. So it's just a question of just trying to, practice doing it, just responding to the instructions. That's it. Just playing the game. Just practice.
Yeah, and there's just two more points that I'd like to mention. These are like very specific exam skills. But the first one is, if it's a challenge for you to start your presentation, and you could probably use this strategy for part 1 and part 3 as well, but just get started. Just say something even if it's just like a reflection of the question. So the teacher says, do you think globalization is important? You can just to get started, you say, yes, I think globalization is important. And just by getting started, you sort of like, you're firing up your engine and you're getting momentum. And once you've fired up this engine and you've got your momentum, then it's much easier to start to continue, So if you are struggling, just say something, even just reflect the question that you just got, but say something and you will find that you will start speaking and ideas will start to come as that engine gets more fired up and gets warmed up.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to practice thinking on your feet. Because, some learners of English will think, right, I need to plan the entire thing from start to finish before I start talking. And it's impossible. You can't do it. And the test doesn't expect you to do that either.
Exactly.
The test expects you to maybe write down a couple of ideas so you get a basic idea of where you're going to go. But you should be practicing, like, making it up as you go along. And trying to follow the points that are given to you, but just putting it all together, thinking on your feet and speaking and thinking at the same time. These are the things you need to practice.
Exactly. And what a lot of students try to do is use their writing brain to communicate to speak.
Yeah.
So they try and construct this grammatically perfect sentence, and then try and speak it. But that speaking is much faster than that. It's much more spontaneous. And this goes back to the core skills again, that this spontaneity you can only get by really focusing on these core skills. And just what you said about thinking on your feet, this reminded me of what I was doing when I was learning Spanish. I would put myself into horrible situations where I really had to think on my feet and just forced it, and those painful memories, I kind of forced myself to like memorize the construction. So next time the person in the market shouting at me if I want 500 grams or 400 grams, I can just fire back and, or just whatever the question, but you're not going to get this spontaneity unless you're putting yourself into these situations.
Right. So just practice. Get the exam tasks, sample ones from the past with the cue cards, and just practice. They can get some old speaking cue cards on your website. Did you say, right?
Yeah. Okay, there's a list there, and we update it each quarter as well.
Okay, cool. Adnan on Facebook asked me this: during the IELTS exam in speaking, do we have to speak in a formal or informal way?
Right. I'll briefly answer this. You want the language you want to use is the same that you would use if you were going for a career job interview.
Right.
So we don't want the kind of conversations or the language you use with your friends down at the pub, nor do we want to be trying to imitate how the Queen of England speaks. We want to upgrade it, and we want it to be formal.
So it's sort of a professional style.
Yeah, I would say maybe semi-formal, because you don't want it so stiff and rigid that you sound pompous.
Yeah. It's kind of neutral.
Yeah.
Which I think in English, our neutral style is fairly informal to an extent. Like the way that we're talking now on the podcast, I think is probably an appropriate kind of style, right?
Yeah.
Like this general style that we've got in this conversation, I think would be classified as a neutral one. It's the sort of thing you'd imagine in a business meeting where people are using first names and things like that. But it's not the kind of slang English that you hear with your friends in the pub, but it's also, as you said, it's not the sort of super formal English that you might hear in the House of Commons or something like that, which is very sort of it's got these certain standards of address and things like that. So just one
other thing, but for a learner of English, for a student taking the exam, if you can find a better word, maybe a more eloquent word, then drop that in. And if, for example, if you're aware that you've said it's really good, If you could upgrade that and just say, it was spectacular, that's going to not only boost your confidence, but it's also going to help you pick up a few points. But one word of warning, only use that strategy if you're confident that you're using the word in the correct way. You're not forcing it.
Right, absolutely. You've got to try and upgrade your English, but make sure it's genuine. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've got a question from Farshid, and it's quite interesting because his question is about the approach to doing the speaking test, and I think he's basically saying what's wrong with sort of rambling fluently, and it's quite interesting because the question is written in a fairly fluid and rambling way. So the question goes like this. I have a question, and it's about the specific strategy that IELTS has in the speaking test. In fact, my question is, what does the specific strategy have to do with getting a job or going abroad? Do people abroad ask travellers questions similar to the ones in IELTS? Why should we abide by those rules, and why are they so strict? I speak fluently, but as soon as I kind of ramble on to maybe elaborate on the answer, I lose points, which makes me furious, and yet I don't get the reason. Is that because you have to get to the point and avoid distractions when speaking? So basically, in summary, why are IELTS speaking tasks designed the way they are? Do they reflect real-life communication? And if you're a fluent student, how can you actually lose points? What other things should you consider beyond just being fluent?
Okay, gotcha. Well, I'm going to jump to the defense of IELTS again because what's his name? Farshid is right, because he's right in observing that it's not actually. Obviously, when I go to England and I go to Marks and Spencer, I don't talk for 2 minutes about my best friend, my childhood best friend, obviously, you know, so, but the exam wants to know this because it's testing you to see, like, of course, you're not going to speak for 2 minutes non-stop in England or Australia. It's highly unnatural. But they want to see that you're capable. And also, a lot of students are taking this exam for university. So in that case, it is kind of like, you know, they don't want students going in saying IELTS says that this is a competent student, and then the student gets into university and has difficulty maybe doing a presentation or communicating or debating, then like, hey, IELTS, you said this guy got a band 7, but he can't even hold a coherent argument. So it is a balance of sort of like, okay, it's not real world as in everyday real world, but the kind of situations that you might be going into, especially academic, it could be useful. So do people abroad ask travellers questions similar to the IELTS? Probably not, but having similar skills that the IELTS examiner pulls out or during the exam will be useful in kind of like everyday, not everyday, but in some circumstances.
I think, I mean, you know, again, in defense of IELTS, it's taken years and years and years to develop a test like this, and that, you know, a hell of a lot of planning, a hell of a lot of research goes into the designing of this test. It's actually mind-boggling how in-depth it is, and how much time and effort is spent on the way that the test is designed. So everything is very, very carefully thought through for various reasons. It might not be obvious, but you know, it's just the process that's necessary for accurately assessing someone's English. You know, many different things have to be taken into account, not just your ability to have a little chat with someone that you meet. And yeah, you are being pushed to do things that you might not have to do on an everyday basis. But I mean, I think part 1 of the speaking test, those are fairly typical questions you might be asked if you meet someone. You're like, hey, you know, so do you live here? Do you live here? What do you know? What are you studying? What do you like about your course? You know, how do you get here? And what's the best way of traveling around the city in your opinion? You know, those sorts of questions. Yeah, I think they are fairly common ones. And the second part, where you have to talk on your own for a couple of minutes. Yeah, I mean, you know, that sort of reflects real life presentation skills that you might have to do, and the discussion at the end where you're discussing abstract things. Yeah, I mean, I think that in a business meeting or a university seminar or something, you might have to have abstract discussions. So I think it's, on balance, I think it is fairly realistic.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like, as you just said, and as Farshid said, everyday English. Not so much the first part, as you said, but the other parts, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. And the other question was about fluency, and I guess what's happening with Farshid is that sometimes when he takes those exams, maybe in part one he might be talking too much, he might be going off topic. And it's kind of like what we said before about writing, that it's important to again make sure you're fulfilling the task and you're not just showing off your flowery English.
Exactly. Yeah.
You got to think of the question that you've been asked, and have you answered that question in a few sentences? Then yes, then just that's it. Your job done. Yeah,
exactly. And like I mean, like we were saying earlier, if we look at this from the examiner's point of view, that if every student that comes in rambles on every single question, of course, it's not going to be a pleasant experience, and it's not what's required by the student, by the exam, for the exam anyway. And Farshid says, if you're a fluent student, how can you lose points? What other things should you consider beyond just fluency? What was it? He said that he rambles on and he loses points because of his fluency. Well, Farshid, I would be very surprised if you lost points because of your fluency. But what I would do, and this is what we go into in my online course of Speaking Confidence, and what we do is I kind of give you a rough framework for you to follow for when you're answering different parts of the question. Different parts of the exam. So for maybe part one, just a couple of sentences. If the examiner says, "Hey, where do you study or do you work?" You don't say, "I work." No, you don't say that. But also, you don't say, "I work. I've got a temporary job down in the centre of Melbourne. I've been there for 3 years. I think the boss is having an affair with the secretary. I don't know. And I think the secretary wants to fire me because she thinks that I know, blah, blah." You're not going to do that. You're just going to give sort of like a brief overview.
Yeah.
And it's just a case of finding the balance. But the framework I give offers sort of like just a couple of sentences. And then if the students, what happens with a lot of students is that sometimes their mind goes blank. And in this case, it's always good just to say because,
Yeah.
Example, just keep it going long enough, but don't make it short and stubby so that the examiner has to work. So you're forcing the examiner to work.
It's kind of the balance, as you said. On one hand, don't say too little, but also don't ramble on too much. There's a time and a place for rambling. Exactly. I think, for example, in episodes of my podcast where I'm just talking, that's one thing. But if I was in my French exam, for example, I tried not to do that. Not that I can in French, but if I was taking the IELTS exam, I would certainly put the rambling on hold and use other skills, like in this conversation, I suppose. So, I mean, I've got other questions. I've got more questions, but I think that we actually are out of time because I've got to go down to the creche to pick up my daughter. I had questions about writing, like how to get proper writing skills. This is a very big question. And how to deal with the chart analysis in the writing section. Questions about listening, like why is it so difficult, basically. Is TOEFL easier than IELTS? And that's kind of it, really, more or less. We're going to have to stop. I think we've probably said quite a lot about the exam, but if people want more information or if they want more specific advice and help, then they can check out your website.
Absolutely, yeah. They can check it out at IELTSpodcast.com, and we give out a lot of IELTS materials. You just have to leave your email for that. And then on the thank you page, when you can leave your email, you also get access. There's also the email address where you can send your direct questions to either myself or the assistant, and we get back usually within 24 hours with an answer for you. So yeah, feel free to send us your questions, and yeah, sign up.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks a lot for talking to us on the podcast today, Ben.
Thank you very much for having me, Luke. I've really enjoyed it. It's been good fun.
It has been good. I hope that listeners out there who are thinking of doing IELTS have got some good bits of advice from us today. All right, well, cool. Speak to you again at some point, maybe.
Definitely. Cheers, Luke.
So there you go. Unfortunately, we couldn't answer all the questions because we ran out of time, but you might find more answers and support on Ben's website, which is IELTSpodcast.com. You can ask Ben and his team questions, and of course, Ben is offering you all 15% off his IELTS course, which is called Jump to Band 7, or it's free. Just use the offer code Luke15 at checkout to get that 15% discount. All right? So if you are taking the IELTS test at some point, then best of luck. Do your best. I hope that you have a good day that day. I hope you feel prepared. You know, it's the Boy Scouts, the code, isn't it? The Boy Scouts that be prepared. That's the mantra there. Be prepared at all times. If you fail to prepare, prepare to fail. Right? Yeah, guys. So, look, guys, if you prepare to fail... I got it wrong, guys. Look, guys, if you fail to prepare to fail, okay? So, yes, make sure you're fully prepared, but good luck if you are taking the test. If you've taken the test, then I hope you're feeling okay. I hope you're not feeling too traumatized. Just, take it easy over the next few days. And if you never have to take the test and you've never done it, then... well, lucky you, I suppose. And if you have taken the test and you got the results you wanted, then congratulations to you. So thank you so much for listening to this. I hope you've enjoyed this double episode. What about upcoming episodes of the podcast, Luke? What can we expect for episodes coming up in the future? Well, let me just have a look at my Google document for the podcast. I've got a Google page which I use to put all my ideas down in. So what have we got coming up? Well, we've got various episodes of Luke's English Podcast Premium, as you know, focusing on probably the episode I did with James recently, the slang game I did recently, and some other bits and pieces, including some language from the first part of this conversation. So there will be premium stuff coming out with all of that language analysed and explained and drilled for pronunciation. But what else? Well, let's see. I've got various ideas. I want to speak to lots of different people. There's still people I know in my life who I haven't interviewed for the podcast, and I think there are some interesting people out there to talk to and some stories for people to tell. I'd like to do another episode about Alan Partridge, another British comedy episode about Alan. Alan Partridge is back on BBC television, actually. He's finally got back onto the BBC. There's a new series of an Alan Partridge TV programme currently being broadcast on BBC One on Monday evenings at 9:30. So Alan Partridge is back on the BBC. So there's lots of Alan-related stuff going on at the moment. So it might be good to do another episode about Alan Partridge. Those Alan Partridge episodes from October last year were very popular. I got lots of correspondence about them. I expect they weren't for absolutely everyone, but none of my episodes are for absolutely everyone, I think. But certainly I got plenty of good responses from them, so I might do a bit more Alan Partridge. I've got something which I've been planning for months, and that is about how people speak, or how people seem to be posh. So the idea of the word posh and poshness in speech and also poshness in people. I've got loads of stuff which I prepared ages ago but have never got around to doing. All about, features of a posh accent and what posh really means, and Posh, in fact, there's like even 5 different types of poshness. Did you know this? Poshness, if I can remember them all, poshness of speech, poshness of taste, poshness of assumed superiority, poshness of family connection, and poshness of extremely bad taste as well, I think is one of them somehow. Anyway, 5 different types of poshness. So I want to do several episodes exploring all of these notions and concepts. And can you identify, when someone is speaking, can you identify if they're posh or not? You might be thinking even now, Luke, what does posh mean? Posh basically means upper class, like high class or upper class. And in terms of English and accents, if you're talking about posh, you're talking about people who are from the aristocracy or certainly from the upper class sections of society. So certainly the royal family, they're very posh. So there is a certain type of speech which will reveal a person to be posh. A few different ways that people can speak that are posh. So what I thought we could do is actually go through various British celebrities, and I would read some information from their Wikipedia page, and you could decide if you consider them to be posh or not, based on which school they went to, their educational background, where they grew up, their name, family connections, and other things. And then we could even listen to those people speaking a little bit and see if we could identify if they sounded posh or not. So that's Posh or Not, which is an episode coming up. And then I've got various other things, loads of other stuff coming up. I'd like to do maybe a few rambling episodes. I haven't done one of them for a while, so maybe I'll do a bit of a ramble and perhaps do a couple of songs on the guitar as well at some point. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, though. I'll speak to you again on the podcast soon, but for now, it's just time to say goodbye. Bye, 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 bye.
Thanks for listening to Luke's English Podcast. For more information, visit teacherluke.co.uk.